The towering redwoods have always been a place of wonder massive, ancient and silent witnesses to centuries of stories, both told and untold. On any given day, the forest feels alive in a way that's hard to explain. The wind moves through. The leaves like a quiet whisper. Beams of sunlight cut through the mist, and the air smells of earth and history. But for some, this place holds more than beauty, holds unanswered questions. It was here, 4 years ago, that two close friends, Daniel and Marissa, set out for what was meant to be a simple weekend hike. They were both avid nature lovers, familiar with trails and survival basics, yet they never came back. Their disappearance shocked their families, puzzled the authorities, and left the local community with a gnawing unease. Search teams combed every path, every stream, every crevice. Dogs tracked faint scents that led to nowhere. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and eventually their case faded from the headlines. But it never faded from the minds of those who loved them. Fast forward to the present. And the redwoods are once again alive with chatter this time. From a group of hikers who unknowingly retraced the same trail Daniel and Marissa took. It was an early morning in late summer. The kind where the fog still hangs heavy between the trunks and your footsteps feel swallowed by the damp forest floor. Among the hikers was a young couple with their toddler, along with a few friends. They weren't looking for mysteries or danger, just fresh air, a good workout, and maybe a few photos to remember the day. But as they ventured deeper into the forest, the mood began to shift. The sounds of birds seemed to fade, and the air grew unnervingly still. They eventually reached a part of the trail that looked less traveled. Moss hung thick on fallen logs, and a faint earthy odor filled the air. That's when one of them spotted something unusual at the base of a massive redwood, something that didn't quite belong. It was a strange, foamy mass, yellow in some parts, almost white in others, with dark patches at the center. It looked alive, as if it were slowly spreading over the ground and creeping up the roots. The group stopped in their tracks. They had seen mushrooms, moss, and lichen before, but this was different. The texture was unsettling, like something halfway between fungus and foam. It pulsed faintly in the breeze, though no one could tell if it was just a trick of the eyes. One of the hikers knelt down to get a closer look, snapping a few photos. The moment their camera clicked, a faint drip of moisture slid from the mass onto the soil, leaving a dark stain. The smell was stronger, now sharp and slightly metallic. The couple with the toddler stepped back instinctively, suddenly uneasy about standing so close. That's when another hiker noticed something even stranger, wedged between the roots of the redwood. Just under the foamy growth was a small strip of faded fabric. It was tangled and half buried, as if the forest had been trying to swallow it whole. They didn't touch it, but the sight was enough to stir a creeping thought among the group. Could it have been clothing? And if so, how long had it been there? The hikers exchanged uneasy glances. The trail wasn't marked as dangerous, and park rangers never mentioned hazardous growths like this. It was just supposed to be another peaceful walk in the woods. But something about this spot felt heavy, most as if the trees themselves were holding a memory. What made the moment even more unsettling was the location. Checking their GPS, one of the hikers realized they were near the very area where Daniel and Marissa had last been seen. The realization sent a chill through the group. No one said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. Was this just a strange natural phenomenon? Or had they stumbled upon a clue that had been hiding here for years? The forest around them seemed to close in as they stood there, the smell of the strange fungus thick in the air. The couple took a step back, clutching their baby a little tighter. Another hiker suggested marking the location and reporting it to the park authorities. But even as they agreed, no one could shake the feeling that they were being watched not by another person, but by the forest itself. The redwoods stood silent, their shadows long and unmoving, as if guarding whatever secret was buried beneath that tree, somewhere deep in the woods. A distant branch cracked. It could have been a deer, maybe just the wind, but no one moved for a moment. Then, almost in unison, they turned and started back down the trail, glancing over their shoulders every few steps. The strange yellow mass remained at the base of the redwood, unmoving, yet somehow aware, and the strip of faded fabric stayed where it was, half hidden in the roots, waiting for someone brave enough, for foolish enough, to find out what lay beneath. What they didn't know then was that this wasn't the first time the fungus had appeared. Locals had whispered for years about patches of it showing up deep in the woods, always in odd places, and always disappearing after a few days. But no one had ever connected it to the missing hikers, until now. Whether it was nature at its most bizarre or something far more disturbing, the truth was out there, tangled in roots and shadows. And so the hikers left the forest that day with more questions than answers. They had come for a walk and left with a mystery that linked them to an unsolved disappearance from years before. The redwoods had kept their silence for 4 long years. The question now was, how much longer would they keep it? The drive back from the trail was quieter than usual. The hikers were still processing what they had seen, each caught in their own thoughts. The couple with the baby sat in the back seat, occasionally exchanging short, uneasy glances. The smell of the forest still clung to their clothes, but it wasn't the fresh, earthy scent they were used to. It was sharper, tinged with that faint metallic note from the strange growth. Every time one of them thought about the yellow foam clinging to the roots, the image of the faded strip of fabric came back. It was too specific, too out of place to dismiss as just litter. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of them. One of the hikers, Jenna, pulled up news archives on her laptop. She typed in the names, Daniel Harris and Marissa Cole. The search brought up old articles from 4 years ago, each headline colder and more clinical than the last. 2 hikers missing in Redwood National Park. Extensive search yields no results. Families plead for information. The photos were the hardest part to look at. Daniel, with his easy smile and messy hair. Marissa, with her bright eyes and camera slung around her neck. They looked like the kind of people who'd laugh in the rain and share trail mix on a long hike, as Jenna read through the details. The similarities to their own hike became clearer. Daniel and Marissa had last been spotted at the same trailhead. Early on a Saturday morning, witnesses recalled seeing them carrying light packs, no heavy gear. The weather that weekend had been mild, no storms, no reports of wild animals in the area. Yet somewhere between midday and sunset, they vanished. No tracks, no abandoned gear, no signs of a struggle. Just gone. What made it even stranger was a brief mention in one of the older articles. A park ranger had noted unusual organic growth in a few parts of the forest around that time, but it was never linked to the disappearance. No photos were provided, and no follow-up stories were written. It was as if the detail had been brushed aside. Jenna leaned closer to the screen, her mind racing. Could the organic growth have been the same strange fungus they saw today? And if so, what did it have to do with 2 missing hikers? The next morning, Jenna called one of her friends from the group. Mark. He was the one who had noticed the GPS location while they were on the trail. She asked if he still had it saved. He did. She also asked him if he'd ever seen anything like that fungus before. He hesitated before answering. Once, he said, but it was years ago. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was some weird mushroom. But now, his voice trailed off. Mark admitted that he'd heard stories from a few older locals. They talked about the forest sickness, patches of strange, foamy growth that would appear suddenly in the redwoods and vanish just as quickly. Sometimes, animals would avoid the area entirely. Other times, they'd find dead insects around the edges, as if the growth had given off something toxic. Most people chalked it up to old folktales, the kind of thing passed around in small communities. But Mark said something else that made Jenna's stomach turn. The growth, he said slowly, was always found where someone had gone missing. That night, Jenna couldn't sleep. She thought about the strip of fabric tangled in the roots, about the silent trees standing over it. The image wouldn't leave her mind. She kept wondering if they should have tried to take the fabric, or at least look closer. But at the time, something about the spot had made her want to leave as quickly as possible. It wasn't just fear, it was a strange, unshakable sense that they weren't supposed to be there. Meanwhile, the couple with the baby, Ryan and Elise, had their own uneasy evening. Elise had been scrolling through her phone, looking at the photos from their hike. She stopped at the one of the fungus. Looked even more unnatural in the picture, like it didn't belong to the same world as the towering trees and ferns around it. She zoomed in and noticed something she hadn't seen before. Just above the dark patch in the foam, near where it met the roots, there seemed to be an indentation. It was small, but it was shaped in a way that made her heart race. It almost looked like a fingerprint. Ryan tried to reassure her, saying it was probably just a natural pattern, but neither of them could ignore how unsettled they felt. They decided not to tell anyone else about the fingerprint, at least for now. But Elise couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had been holding something backhand, that they had just brushed against the edge of it. A few days later, Mark suggested they go back to the site, this time with better equipment, gloves, masks, and a proper camera. Jenna agreed, though part of her dreaded the idea. Something about returning felt risky, but the pull of unanswered questions was stronger. Ryan and Elise were hesitant, especially with the baby, but curiosity was starting to outweigh their initial fear. Before they could set a date, Jenna decided to visit the local ranger station to see if she could find more details. The ranger on duty, an older man named Bill, listened quietly as she described the fungus they had seen. When she mentioned the faded fabric, his expression changed, subtle, but enough for her to notice. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Best to stay clear of anything like that. It could be dangerous, could be nothing. But the forest has a way of keeping its own secrets." When Jenna asked if he knew about the forest sickness, Bill paused for a long moment before answering. "That's old talk," he said finally. "Been around since before my time. People used to say the forest could claim things. Not just animals, people too. Every time someone went missing, there'd be talk about strange growths or odd smells in the area. But there's no proof of anything, just stories." He wouldn't say more, but as Jenna left the station, she caught him watching her from the window. It wasn't the look of someone worried about tourists. It was the look of someone who knew more than they were willing to share. Back at home, Jenna started compiling everything they had learned. Photos of the fungus, notes from the news articles, Mark's GPS coordinates, and now the strange reaction from the ranger. The pieces didn't fit together yet, but they felt connected. And every time she looked at the photo of the growth, she thought about Daniel and Marissa. Were they somewhere in that forest still, lost to time and roots? Or had the forest taken them in some other way, one that no one understood? The plan to return to the Redwoods was starting to take shape, though no one knew what they were hoping to find: answers, more clues, or maybe just confirmation that the thing they saw was real. The mystery hung between them like a shadow, growing heavier with each passing day. What none of them realized yet was that the forest was already aware of them. Whatever had been watching from between the trunks that day, whatever had been listening to their voices and tracking their footsteps, hadn't forgotten. And the deeper they planned to go, the closer they were coming to a truth that might not want to be found. Mark couldn't shake the idea that they were standing at the edge of something far bigger than they understood. He spent late nights scrolling through obscure forums, reading about rare fungi, forest ecosystems, and old hiker disappearance cases. Most of what he found seemed far-fetched claims of paranormal activity. People talking about the forest breathing or hearing whispers when no one else was around. Still, a few details kept repeating in different threads: strange yellow or white foamy growths, the smell of metal, and sightings in the same small areas of dense redwood forest. The sightings were rare, but each time, there had been at least one report of a missing animal, sometimes a person. Jenna, on the other hand, approached it differently. She began contacting families of missing hikers, pretending at first to be doing research for a Nature article. Most didn't want to talk, but one woman, whose brother had vanished a decade ago, was willing to share her story. She described a day hike that turned into an unexplained nightmare. He had gone ahead on the trail while she tied her shoes, and by the time she reached the next turn, he was gone. Search dogs followed his scent for nearly a mile before it abruptly ended in a clearing. When Jenna asked if she'd ever heard about strange growths or fungus near where he disappeared, the woman went quiet, then said she remembered seeing something pale and foamy clinging to the side of a fallen log. She hadn't thought it mattered at the time. Meanwhile, Ryan and Elise were wrestling with a different kind of conflict. Elise didn't want to take their baby anywhere near the redwoods again, but Ryan argued that the only way to feel at peace was to understand what they had stumbled onto. Elise countered that maybe some things were better left unexplored. The discussion kept coming back late at night, whispered arguments over whether to return to that exact spot. It wasn't just fear, it was also the feeling that the forest might somehow recognize them if they came back. The tension among the group grew as they made plans for the return trip. Mark wanted to go in during early morning fog, reasoning that fewer people would be on the trail. Jenna wanted to talk to the park ranger again, maybe catch him off guard and get more details. Ryan wanted to bring better tools, something to take samples of the fungus. Elise wanted none of it. She was the only one still replaying that moment when she saw what looked like a fingerprint on the yellow foam. She hadn't told Jenna or Mark about that. It's partly because she didn't want to sound paranoid, and partly because deep down, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know whose fingerprint it might have been. Outside of their little circle, there were other ripples forming. The ranger, Bill, found himself pacing more than usual at the station. He'd seen growths like that before, years ago, and every time they appeared, trouble followed. The first time was during his rookie year, when 2 experienced hunters had gone missing. The second was a group of college kids who vanished during a camping trip. Each time, the same yellow foam clung to trees like a quiet warning. Bill knew the forest's patterns better than anyone, and he knew when something was wrong. But he also knew that speaking openly about it would only invite trouble for him and for anyone who decided to dig too deep. A few days before the planned return, Jenna received an envelope in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, old and slightly faded. It showed a massive redwood trunk with a yellow foamy growth, almost identical to the one they'd seen. But what drew her attention wasn't the fungus, it was the object partially buried at the base of the tree. It looked like the corner of a backpack, frayed and covered in dirt. Scrawled on the back of the photo in uneven handwriting were 3 words: "Don't go back." She showed the picture to Mark the next day. His first instinct was that it was some kind of prank, maybe from someone on the forums who had pieced together their interest. But Jenna pointed out the date stamped on the bottom corner, nearly 6 years ago. Whoever had taken the photo had been there long before they had. The warning felt real, not staged. Still, Mark argued that it only made it more important to see for themselves. The photograph might not be the same location, but what if there was a connection? Ryan's thoughts were shifting too. He'd been doing his own research, and he found a scientific paper about a rare slime mold known for its bright yellow color and ability to move slowly across surfaces. The strange part was that this species wasn't supposed to be native to the redwoods. According to the paper, it had only been documented in a few remote areas on other continents. He kept thinking about how the forest seemed untouched, isolated, damned, yet somehow something foreign had taken root. The scientist in him wanted answers, but the father in him hesitated. On the morning they finally agreed to set a date, Elise woke up from a dream that felt too real. In it, she was standing in the redwoods again, holding the baby close. The air was cold, heavy with fog. She could hear dripping somewhere nearby, a slow, steady sound. When she turned toward it, the yellow foam was there, bigger than before, stretching farther up the trunk. She tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. Something was pulling her forward. When she woke, her hands were clenched so tightly that her knuckles ached. As the group moved closer to their return trip, the forest itself seemed to push back. The weather forecast showed an unusual pattern: thick fog and rain predicted for several days. Even though the season was usually dry, park bulletins warned about unstable trails from fallen branches. It was as if the forest was finding reasons to keep people out. But that didn't stop the plan. The main conflict was no longer just curiosity versus fieta, was the pull between what they wanted to know and what they were willing to risk. Jenna saw the mystery as a puzzle begging to be solved. Mark saw it as a chance to uncover something no one else had. Ryan saw it as an unexplained biological phenomenon that needed to be documented. And Elise saw it as a warning they should have heeded the first time. Somewhere in the redwoods, past the well-traveled trails and into the shadowed paths where the air feels colder, the yellow foam still clung to its tree. The strip of faded fabric still lay tangled in the roots, and the soil around it stayed damp, even in dry weather. And if anyone had been close enough, they might have sworn they saw the faintest ripple pass across the surface of the fungus if it knew they were coming back. The day of their return came wrapped in a heavy fog that seemed to settle over everything like a thick blanket. The redwoods were quieter than they remembered, their massive trunks fading into the mist as if the forest itself wanted to swallow them whole. The group met at the trailhead just after sunrise. Jenna carried a backpack with extra batteries, a flashlight, gloves, and a small container in case they could collect a sample. Mark had his GPS device and a high-resolution camera slung over his shoulder. Ryan had packed a mask, a pair of long tongs, and a sealed jar. Elise stood slightly apart from the others, clutching her rain jacket closed as if it might shield her from more than just the cold. From the start, the air felt different. There was no wind, no birdsong, no rustling of leaves, just the muffled sound of their footsteps against the damp earth. Every time one of them spoke, their voice felt swallowed by the fog. They followed the same route as before, the familiar twists and turns of the trail slowly giving way to less trodden ground. Moss hung from low branches like heavy curtains, and the path narrowed until they were walking single file. The GPS led them deeper until the air began to change. The metallic temps hit them first faint at first, then stronger with each step. Elise slowed, her hand tightening on Ryan's arm. "It's close," Mark whispered, as though raising his voice might draw unwanted attention. Jenna glanced over her shoulder, scanning the tree line. The mist made everything seem closer than it was, shapes shifting just beyond clear sight. When they finally saw it, no one moved for a long moment. The yellow foam was there, but it was not as they had left it. It was bigger now, stretching higher, up the base of the redwood and spilling farther across the forest floor. The texture seemed denser, almost swollen, as if it had been feeding on something. The dark patches were larger too, their centers slick with moisture that dripped slowly into the soil. Jenna moved first, pulling on her gloves and crouching a few feet away. She could hear her own breathing loud inside the mask she'd put on. The smell was stronger here, sharp and damp. She reached out with the tongs, hesitating before touching the surface. The foam yielded slightly under the pressure, like soft clay. A slow ripple passed through it. So faint, she almost thought she'd imagined it. Ryan knelt beside her, unscrewing the lid of the jar. "Just a small piece," he murmured, as though speaking to himself. He slid the tongs under a section of the growth and lifted. A strand of it stretched upward before snapping, the piece dropping into the jar with a wet sound. Almost instantly, a thin trail of moisture began seeping from the cut edge on the tree. Sliding downward into the roots, Elise had stepped back several paces, unable to take her eyes off the strip of fabric that was still lodged between the roots. The fog swirled around it, and for a moment she thought she saw another strip of cloth just beneath the surface of the foam. But when she blinked, it was gone. She turned to say something to Mark, but he was standing completely still, camera raised, his lens fixed on something deeper in the forest. "Did you see that?" he whispered, not lowering the camera. The others froze. Movement just past that cedar, about 20 feet. No one else could see clearly through the fog, but the sense of being watched was suddenly heavy. Pressing down on all of them, a sound broke the silence, soft at first, then sharper. It was like something wet shifting across the ground, slow, but deliberate. It came from behind the redwood, the same side where the foam had spread. Jenna looked at Ryan, her eyes wide over the edge of her mask. "We should go," she said, her voice low but urgent. Mark shook his head, trying to adjust his focus. Just one more shot. But before he could finish, a faint vibration traveled through the soil beneath their feet. It wasn't strong enough to knock them off balance, but it was enough for each of them to feel it. Like the ground itself had taken a shallow breath. The metallic smell grew stronger, almost choking. The foam's surface shifted again, more visibly. This time, like a slow wave rolling outward. The dripping quickened, droplets falling faster into the soil. Elise grabbed Ryan's arm. "We need to leave. Now." From somewhere beyond the fog, a single crack echoed sharp, like a branch snapping under weight. Then another, each one closer than the last. Mark finally lowered the camera, his earlier confidence gone. "Something's moving out there," he said, his voice tight. The forest seemed to close in as they began to back away from the redwood. Every step felt heavier, the silence pressing harder against their ears. The GPS beeped softly in Mark's hand, a reminder of their exact location coordinates that now felt less like a record and more like a mark. They'd regret leaving behind as they put more distance between themselves and the foam. Jenna glanced back one last time. The fog had thickened, but she could still see the yellow mass clinging to the tree. It looked larger still, as if it had swelled in the short moments they'd been there. And she could swear, just for a second, that the dark patch in its center wasn't just a shadow. It was an opening. The sound came again, wet, deliberate movement, and, this time, it wasn't behind the tree. It was following. The group quickened their pace, their boots thudding softly against the damp trail. But the sound of something moving through the fog matched them, step for step. It wasn't fast, but it was steady to be the random noise of an animal. Elise's breath came quick, her hand gripping Ryan's sleeve so tightly he could feel her nails through the fabric. Mark kept glancing over his shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was behind them. But the fog refused to give up its shapes. They followed the trail for another 100 yards before Mark suddenly stopped. The GPS in his hand flickered, the screen glitching with static lines. "That's weird," he muttered, tapping it. But the device didn't respond. Instead, the coordinates on the screen shifted, jumping several miles off their known location. He frowned, shaking it again. "It's like it's pulling us somewhere else." Jenna moved closer to see, and a chill ran through her. The new coordinates pointed to a section of the redwoods that wasn't part of any marked trail-in area that had been closed off years ago after a landslide. She remembered reading about it while looking into the disappearance of Daniel and Marissa. The last ping from their phones had come from somewhere near that very location. Before they could discuss it, the noise behind them stopped completely. The sudden silence was worse than the sound itself. Everyone froze, straining to hear anything's footsteps, breathing, movement, but there was nothing. The fog pressed closer, and for a moment it felt like the forest was holding its breath. With them, then, faintly, from somewhere off the trail, came a low, humming sound. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't natural. It was steady, almost rhythmic. Like something alive, but not human. Mark turned his head toward the sound, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's coming from the new coordinates." His tone carried a mix of curiosity and dread. Elise shook her head, her eyes wide. "No, we're not going deeper." But even as she said it, the air shifted and a faint breeze drifted toward them, carrying that same sharp, metallic smell. Ryan crouched down, brushing his hand over the soil. It was damp, but not from rain. There was a thin sheen of the same slick moisture they'd seen dripping from the foam. And it wasn't just here. It stretched forward, faint but visible, leading like a trail deeper into the trees. He looked up at Jenna. "It's moving." They followed the slick trail with their eyes until it disappeared into the fog in the same direction as the humming. Every instinct said to turn back, yet something about the scene felt like a doorway had cracked open like the forest was, offering them a glimpse into something it had never intended for them to see. Mark raised his camera again, snapping photos into the fog. The flash lit up the mist in bursts, each one revealing only glimpses of tangled roots and massive trunks. But in the third shot, something reflected the light back. It wasn't an animal's eyes. 'Twas duller, more like metal, catching the flash. He checked the preview screen, zooming in, and his hands went still. "That's a zipper." The others crowded around. The reflection was faint, but unmistakably a zipper pull, half buried in the soil, surrounded by the slick trail. It looked weathered, but not rusted. Ryan's voice was tight when he spoke. That could belong to. He didn't finish the sentence. But they all knew who he meant. The humming sound grew slightly louder, vibrating through the air in a way they could almost feel in their chests. Jenna took a slow step forward, but Elise grabbed her arm. "No, this is exactly how they disappeared." Her voice cracked, fear sharpening every word. But the pull of the unknown was strong, and it was Mark who finally said, "If that's their gear, we can't just leave it here." The forest seemed to react to his words. A distant crack echoed through the trees, followed by a rustling that was no longer behind them. What's ahead? Something was moving toward the zipper, toward the source of the humming. And the smell was stronger now, thick enough to taste on the back of their tongues. They stood frozen in the path, torn between retreat and discovery, as the fog began to swirl unnaturally, curling in slow spirals around the trunks. Somewhere in that shifting white, just beyond sight, something waited. And when it moved again, they realized with a sick certainty, wasn't alone. The humming grew louder until it seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. The fog parted just enough to reveal a dark shape ahead, tall, still, and strangely human-like. They moved closer, hearts pounding, until they saw it clearly. An old, weather-beaten tent, its fabric half collapsed and covered in moss. The zipper Mark had photographed was part of its entrance, the pole slightly rusted but intact. Ryan knelt and tugged it open. A rush of cold, stale air escaped, carrying that same metallic scent. Inside, they found a small lantern, a pair of boots, and a backpack, with initials stitched on the side. DM Jenna's stomach dropped. "Daniel, Marissa," she whispered. Elisa's hand flew to her mouth. The realization was sharp. The missing couple had been here. Deep in the closed-off woods, before they could examine further, a shadow swept past the tent. Not running, gliding. Mark spun, camera flashing wildly, catching only a blur. The humming shifted in tone, becoming faster, almost urgent, as if whatever was producing it was aware of them now. Ryan grabbed the backpack. "We're leaving. Now." They backed away, but the fog swirled in heavy coils, closing in around them. Then came the twist. Jenna's phone lit up with a signal. Something impossible this far into the forest. A single message appeared on her screen, time-stamped just seconds ago. It read, "Don't follow it. We couldn't get out." The sender's name was Daniel Marissa. Everyone froze, the weight of the warning sinking in. But before they could react, the humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the faint, unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind them again. The footsteps grew louder, crunching slowly over the damp ground. No one dared to speak. Ryan tightened his grip on the backpack, while Mark's camera hung limply at his side, the lens still fogged from the cold air. The four of them, instinctively, stepped closer together, their breaths shallow. A faint silhouette began to form in the mist, its outline shifting and bending like it wasn't entirely solid. The closer it came, the more it felt like the forest itself was leaning in to listen. Jenna swallowed hard, forcing her voice to stay steady. "Who's there?" The figure paused, and for a moment it felt like the entire forest paused with it. Then, in the softest, almost broken tone, a reply came. "You shouldn't be here." The voice sounded strained, like it was pushing through layers of distance to reach them. Elise stepped forward instinctively, but Ryan pulled her back. The silhouette's head tilted toward the old tent, toward the place where Daniel's backpack had been hidden, and then it began to fade. The outline dissolved into thin strands of fog until nothing stood there at all. The forest seemed to exhale, the air warming slightly as if some invisible tension had released. The humming never returned. Mark raised his camera and scrolled through his recent shots, hands trembling. "You need to see this," he said, holding it out. The images showed the tent, the moss, the backpack, and then, in one frame, the same shadowy figure they had just seen. But in the picture, the figure's face was almost visible. A man in his early 30s, pale and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to plead for something. Jenna recognized him instantly from the news reports. Daniel Marissa. They didn't run after that. They walked, steadily and without looking back, until the mist thinned and the familiar outline of the trailhead came into view. Once they reached a parked car, no one spoke for several minutes. Ryan placed the backpack gently in the trunk as if it might shatter, and they all got inside. The drive back was silent except for the rhythmic sound of the tires on wet gravel. It was only when they reached town that Jenna broke the quiet. "We have to give this to the authorities," she said, her voice low but certain. Ryan nodded. "And the pictures?" Mark hesitated, glancing down at his camera. "Some of them, I'm not sure people will believe." Elise turned in her seat to face him. "Maybe they don't have to. Maybe it's not about convincing everyone. It's about giving Daniel's family something to hold on to." The next morning, they met with the sheriff and handed over the backpack, the boots, and Mark's camera card. The sheriff listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When they finished, he told them quietly that the search for Daniel and his wife had been called off months ago due to lack of leads. "But this," he said, resting a hand on the backpack, "this might help us understand what happened." Days passed, and while no official statement was made, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter in the forest hadn't been just a coincidence. She went back over every detail in her mind, the sudden signal on her phone, the voice telling them they shouldn't be there, the warning not to follow it. Whatever it was, she realized it wasn't Daniel. And maybe Daniel had been trying to protect them from it, even now. A week later, Mark called with news. "I went through the rest of the pictures," he said. "There's something else." In one of them, just behind Daniel, there's another shape, taller, watching him. Jenna's stomach tightened. Do you think it's still out there? Mark hesitated before answering. I think it never left. That night, Jenna sat by her window, watching the fog roll in over the hills. She thought about the strange sense of calm that had followed Daniel's appearance, as though his message had been the only thing keeping them safe. She realized then that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved completely. They're meant to be respected. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal. Elise started a new job. Ryan took on more shifts at the garage, and Mark began developing his photos for a small gallery show. But they all knew that somewhere, deep in that forest, the story wasn't over. It never would be. The mist would return, and with it, the echo of footsteps that didn't belong to the living. Jenna kept Daniel's warning saved in her phone, not because she needed proof, but because it reminded her of something important, that sometimes listening to the voice that tells you to turn back can save your life. And maybe, in some strange way, Daniel had finally found a way out by leading them safely home. The forest remained off-limits, its paths overgrown and unmarked. But on quiet nights, when the wind shifted just right, they each swore they could hear the faint hum again, far in the distance. None of them ever went back to check. Some doors, they agreed, are better left closed. And so the mystery settled. Not with answers carved in stone, but with an unspoken agreement between the living and whatever lingered in the fog. They had been given a second chance, and that was enough. The forest kept its secrets, and they kept theirs. In the end, the real story wasn't about what they said, was about what they chose to walk away from.